Clara had always lived a life of sacrifice. After the untimely death of her husband, her world had turned upside down. She was left alone with her two young daughters, Titi and Tolu, in the small, crumbling house they called home. The house wasn't much, old and worn, with cracked walls and a leaky roof, but it had been their sanctuary. It was the only thing Clara had left of her husband, the place where they had shared their happiest memories. But as time went on, the situation became harder. Clara worked long hours as a seamstress, stitching clothes for the villagers to make ends meet. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't keep up with the rising cost of living, and the money she earned barely covered the basics. She tried to pursue Titi and Tolu, however, were bright and ambitious. Even in their dire circumstances, they excelled in school, their grades always at the top of their class. Clara saw in them the hope for a better future, a future that she never had. Her husband had always dreamed of sending them to school, of giving them the opportunity to break free from the cycle of poverty. Clara vowed that she would make that dream a reality, no matter the cost. But when the local school announced it was closing down due to lack of funds, Clara felt the walls of her world closing in. The nearest school with a decent education was in the city, but tuition fees were exorbitant, and there was no way she could afford it. She thought about the future of her daughters, how hard they worked, how they deserved so much more. It felt like the universe was pushing her to the brink of desperation. One evening, as Clara sat in the dim light of their small kitchen, staring at the tattered bills that were scattered in front of her, she felt the weight of the decision she had to make. The house. It was all she had left. The only asset she could rely on. The only place she could call home. But she also knew it was the one thing standing between her daughters and their dreams. Her husband had always dreamed of a better life for their children. Clara remembered the hopeful conversations they had shared before he passed away, talks about sending their daughters to school, about giving them the chance to have something better than what they had. But now, as a widow, Clara was the sole person holding on to that dream. And she was willing to fight for it, no matter the cost. But tonight, as Clara sat alone in the quiet house, the weight of her responsibilities pressed on her heart like a heavy stone. Titi and Tolu, despite the odds, had done well in school. They were bright, curious, and eager to learn, excelling in their studies year after year. Clara watched with pride as they grew, but she couldn't ignore the bitter reality: the local school was closing down due to lack of funding, and the only other schools that offered a real education were miles away in the city. The city was out of reach for Clara. She couldn't afford the transportation, let alone the tuition fees. The thought of losing everything her daughters had worked so hard for kept Clara awake at night. The city was a world they had only dreamed of, a place filled with opportunity. And Clara was determined to get them there, no matter the cost. But where would the money come from? As Clara sat at the kitchen table, her thoughts drifted to the only asset she had left, the house. It had been their home for so long. It was the place where she and Chuka had raised their daughters, the place where laughter had filled the rooms, and the place where Clara had felt safe. But it was also the one thing that could get Titi and Tolu the education they deserved. The house had lost much of its value over the years, and Clara had never thought she would have to part with it, but now, faced with the choice of her daughter's future or her own attachment to the past, she was forced to confront a painful reality. Clara had no other choice. If she sold the house, she could use the money to pay for her daughter's school fees in the city. It would be enough to send them away to get the education they needed, to secure the life they deserved. It was the only way. The thought of leaving her home behind made her stomach twist in knots. She had spent years maintaining this house, patching up leaks, repainting, and doing everything she could to keep it standing. But the roof leaked more with each passing season, and the cracks in the walls seemed to grow. The house that had once been filled with life now seemed like a tomb, its memories haunting Clara every time she walked through the door. But she also knew it was the only thing standing between her daughters and their future. Clara stood up slowly, walking to the window and looking out at the small yard. The stars twinkled above, and the cool night air whispered through the trees. Titi and Tolu were fast asleep in their room, unaware of the turmoil brewing in their mother's heart. Clara's gaze softened as she watched the gentle movement of the wind through the trees. The world outside was quiet, but inside, Clara's mind was racing. She thought of Titi's determination, the way her daughter studied late into the night, even when the power was out. Titi had dreams of becoming a doctor, of helping the sick and the poor in their village. And Tolu, her strong, independent Tolu, dreamed of becoming a lawyer, fighting for justice where there was none. Clara had always told them, "Dream big, my daughters. The world is yours to take." But now, it seemed like their dreams were slipping away, just out of reach. "I'll do it for them," Clara whispered to herself, her voice barely a breath. She knew there was no other way. The house had to be sold. She could not stand in the way of her daughter's future. She would make the sacrifice, just as she had sacrificed so much already in their short lives. The next day, Clara set about making the arrangements. She met with a local real estate agent, and they discussed the sale of the house. The price was far less than what the house was worth, but there was no time to negotiate. The sale would provide just enough to get Titi and Tolu into the city and into school. It was a decision that ripped Clara apart. She loved that house. It had been her and Chuka's dream to build a family there. But now, the only thing that mattered was getting her daughters the education they needed to escape the cycle of poverty that had held their family captive for so long. The day the house was sold, Clara felt a deep emptiness inside her. She handed over the keys to the new owner, her hands trembling. But as she walked away from the house, a wave of determination washed over her. She had done it. She had made the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of her daughters. That evening, Clara sat in the small room she would now call home. The familiar smell of the old house was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of a new beginning. She closed her eyes and imagined Titi and Tolu's bright futures filled with opportunity, success, and fulfillment. Clara's heart swelled with pride, even as the pain of leaving her home behind lingered. Her daughter's future was secure. And as long as they succeeded, all of her sacrifices would have been worth it. The bus ride to the city was a blur. Titi and Tolu sat together by the window, clutching their bags tightly as the dusty road stretched on ahead. The village they were leaving behind was small, familiar, and comforting. It was where they had spent their childhood, where their mother had worked tirelessly to make sure they had food, where they had laughed, fought, and dreamed of a future beyond the dirt roads and thatched roofs. But now, that world was fading into the distance. The city was unknown, vast, and intimidating. It was the place their mother had always talked about, the place where dreams could become reality, if you were brave enough to chase them. But as the bus bounced along the uneven roads, both girls felt a sense of unease settle deep within them. Their mother had sold everything to send them to this city. She had sacrificed the one thing she had left, the house they had grown up in, just to give them this chance. Titi stared out the window, watching the countryside pass by in a blur of green and brown. Her heart was heavy. The thought of leaving their village, of leaving their mother behind, was almost too much to bear. Clara had kissed them goodbye with tears in her eyes, whispering promises that they would make her proud. She had told them that this was the way forward, that education was the key to breaking free from the chains of poverty. But as they traveled further from home, Titi couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at her. Tolu, on the other hand, sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the passing landscape. Unlike her sister, Tolu was always the more independent of the two. She had always been the one to hold things together when their mother struggled, the one to take charge when things felt chaotic. But even Tolu couldn't escape the overwhelming weight of the decision that had been made for them. Their mother had entrusted them with her dream, with the hope that they would find a way to succeed in the world outside the village. The pressure was mounting, and though Tolu didn't show it, she felt it deep inside. As the bus entered the city, the towering buildings, flashing lights, and noisy streets hit them like a tidal wave. Titi and Tolu had only seen the city in passing, during their occasional trips for supplies, but now they were truly in the heart of it. The streets were crowded with people hustling from place to place, cars honked loudly, and the air smelled of exhaust fumes and fast food. It was chaotic and vibrant, alive with possibility, but also overwhelming. When the bus finally came to a stop, Titi and Tolu disembarked, their hearts racing. They had nowhere to go but forward. They had to make it in the city. There was no turning back. Their first few days in the city were a blur of confusion and adjustment. They stayed in a modest, run-down apartment in a neighborhood far from the city center, a place where people like them, people from villages, people who had come to the city to make something of themselves, lived. The apartment was small, with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors, but it was a place to rest. It was a starting point. Each morning, they woke up early, ready to face the day. Titi and Tolu enrolled in their respective schools, the business college for Titi and law school for Tolu. The courses were challenging, far more difficult than anything they had encountered back home. The language of the textbooks, the lectures, and the fast-paced lifestyle of the city were all foreign to them. But they were determined to succeed. They had no choice. Titi struggled in her first few weeks. She felt out of place, lost among classmates who seemed to know so much more than she did. The assignments were harder, the pressure greater. She found herself staying up late into the night, working through assignments she could barely understand, her mind racing with doubts. What if she wasn't smart enough? What if she couldn't make it? One evening, after a particularly grueling study session, Titi collapsed onto her bed, overwhelmed with frustration. She stared at the ceiling, the weight of her mother's sacrifice pressing down on her chest like an unrelenting burden. What if it was all for nothing? What if she failed her mother? What if all the effort she had put in years of studying, years of trying to make her mother proud, was wasted? But then, she remembered her mother's words. "Dream big, my daughter. The world is yours to take." Titi took a deep breath. She wasn't going to let fear win. She wasn't going to give up. She had to succeed, not just for herself, but for her mother, who had given everything to make this possible. With renewed determination, Titi picked up her textbooks and began to study again, this time with a clear purpose. Tolu, meanwhile, was doing her best to stay focused on her law studies. She had always been driven, always sought justice and fairness, and law was her calling. But as the weeks went on, she started to feel the weight of the city pressing on her. The city was full of distractions, fast-paced, noisy, and relentless. She found herself staying up late, not just to study, but to think about everything her mother had sacrificed. Tolu was grateful, of course, but the guilt weighed heavily on her heart. Her mother had worked herself to the bone for them, and now, they were in the city, trying to make something of themselves. It wasn't just about education, it was about honoring the years of struggle their mother had endured. One night, after an exhausting day of classes and assignments, Tolu sat on the balcony of their apartment, gazing out at the city below. The lights of the city glittered like stars, but Tolu felt small in comparison. She thought about her mother, who was back in the village, probably worrying about them. She thought about her younger brother and sister, who were still too young to understand the sacrifice their mother had made. "I'll make it," Tolu whispered to herself, clenching her fist. "I'll make her proud." Titi and Tolu's bond grew even stronger as the weeks went by. They were in this together, no matter how tough it got. They studied together, cooked together, and encouraged each other during moments of doubt. Slowly, they began to find their rhythm in the city. They learned how to navigate the bustling streets, how to make new friends, and how to balance their academic pressures with the realities of city life. Through it all, one thing remained constant: they never forgot their mother's sacrifice. Every success, every small victory, every passing exam was dedicated to her. They promised themselves that no matter how hard it got, they would rise. They would succeed. For Clara had always been a woman who relied on herself. Through every trial and hardship, she had faced each day with the same quiet resolve, determined, focused, and ever hopeful for a brighter future for her daughters. Yet, as the years went by, she couldn't help but feel the weight of time bearing down on her. Her once strong body, accustomed to the endless labor of raising her children alone, had begun to show signs of wear. The aches and pains from years of hard work had become more pronounced, and she was finding it harder to make ends meet, even with the small tailoring business she had set up in the local market. Her daughters were doing well, having completed their education in the city. Titi had become a successful businesswoman, working with a major corporation, and Tolu was on her way to becoming a lawyer, already working at a prestigious firm. Clara couldn't be prouder of them. Every achievement they reached was a testament to her sacrifices, a reflection of everything she had given up to make their dreams come true. But despite the success of her daughters, Clara's life remained humble, and her health continued to decline. She had moved from one rented apartment to another in the small town, living modestly, holding on to the hope that her daughters would one day be able to support her. But even as the world seemed to move on for them, Clara felt stuck, as though she was treading water, unable to rise above her current circumstances. One particularly cold afternoon, Clara sat in her modest living room, nursing a cup of warm tea as she reflected on her life. The house she had sold all those years ago was still something that lingered in her heart. It wasn't just the home, it was the life she had built with her late husband, Chuka. She had made countless memories there, and although she knew that part of her life was over, there were days when she still longed for the comfort and security it had once provided. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone ringing. It was an unfamiliar number, but Clara answered anyway. "Hello, is this Mrs. Clara?" a deep, professional voice asked. "This is Samuel Ofori, a lawyer from the city. I have some news regarding an inheritance left to you by a distant relative. I would like to discuss it with you." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had never been told of any distant relatives who could leave her an inheritance. She thought it was some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. But the lawyer's calm and professional tone made her listen intently. "An inheritance?" Clara repeated, unsure whether she should be hopeful or skeptical. "Yes, ma'am. It's from your late great-uncle, a businessman who passed away several years ago. He left behind a sum of money, along with some properties, and it's been sitting in trust until now. I believe the funds are rightfully yours, and I would like to meet with you to discuss the details." Clara was in disbelief. She had never known of this great-uncle, and yet now, suddenly, she was being told she had been left a fortune. The thought of receiving such a windfall was almost too much to process. For years, she had struggled to get by, doing everything she could to provide for her daughters, never expecting anything in return. But now, it seemed, the universe was offering her a chance to finally break free from the constant financial strain. The lawyer gave her the details, and after hanging up, Clara sat in stunned silence. Was this really happening? How could a distant relative leave her such a legacy? Could it be true? She knew she had to meet the lawyer in person to understand the situation fully, but for the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope light up in her chest. Clara traveled to the city, a place she hadn't visited in years. She was nervous, her hands trembling as she sat in the waiting room of the lawyer's office. The city was bustling with activity, and everything felt so foreign to her, so much bigger than the small life she had built. She had always thought of herself as a simple woman, a village woman, someone who belonged to the land and the people. But now, sitting in this grand office, she felt out of place. The lawyer, Samuel Ofori, greeted her warmly, offering her a seat and a glass of water. He explained everything in calm detail, handing her a folder with legal documents and papers. Clara listened intently, her mind racing with confusion and awe. Her great-uncle had indeed left her an inheritance, a sum of money that was more than she could have ever imagined. But there was more. He had also left behind a piece of land in the city, a business portfolio, and other valuable assets that had grown considerably over the years. The money alone was enough to change Clara's life and the lives of her daughters. The land was in an up-and-coming part of the city, now worth a fortune. The assets were a mix of properties and businesses that had appreciated immensely since her great-uncle's passing. As Samoa explained the details, Clara could barely process the information. She had gone from living in poverty, scraping by on a few coins, to being the owner of multiple properties and businesses worth millions. The sense of disbelief was overwhelming. But Samoa wasn't done. He slid another piece of paper across the table, a letter from Clara's great-uncle. The letter was long and eloquent, filled with details about the family's history and business dealings. It explained how her great-uncle had watched her struggles from afar and had left his fortune as a way to repay her for the sacrifices she had made for her daughters. He had heard of her struggles and had wanted to ensure that she would never have to live in poverty again. There was a sense of pride in the letter, but also a hint of mystery. The letter spoke of a larger legacy, a family business that Clara had never known existed. It detailed how the inheritance was part of a much bigger plan, one that would eventually require her involvement, as her great-uncle had left it all in her hands. There was a phrase in the letter that stood out to Clara: "The future is in your hands, Clara. The business, the legacy, the possibilities. You will be the one to carry it forward." Clara's mind swirled with questions. What did this mean? What was this business her great-uncle had left her? Why had he chosen her to inherit it? And why had he never spoken to her about it before? There were many things she didn't understand, but one thing was clear: her life had changed forever. She had worked so hard, sacrificed everything for her daughters. Now, her family's future was filled with possibilities she could never have dreamed of. Titi